In this lecture, let's look at a feature in Unity to help us reuse game objects. By default, every game object is considered to be a unique copy. If we have two game objects that look the same, they are not considered the same from Unity's perspective. Changes applied to one object will not be reflected in the other. Let's look at an example. Our game may have an army of robots. In the hierarchy, I'm going to create a duplicate copy of the robot game object by pressing Ctrl D. If you're on a Mac, the keyboard shortcut would be Command D. Next, the game objects may overlap with one another. Try moving the second robot next to the first object. Awesome, we have two copies of our robots. Initially, they share similar appearances. However, if we modify one object, the other object will not be reflected with those changes. On the second robot, I may want to change the size. Let's increase the scale with the Scale tool. As the scale increases, the other robot remains the same size. They're independent of one another. In some cases, I may want the changes to be reflected in all copies of the robot. Otherwise, we would have to repeat the changes. We can resolve our issue with something called a prefab. Prefab is short for prefabrication. The purpose of a prefab is to store the original copy of a game object. By storing a copy, we can reuse this copy in our game. Best of all, changes are reflected in all copies when the prefab is updated. Creating prefabs is simple. Before creating a prefab, let's delete the second copy of the robot. You can delete a game object from a scene by selecting it from the hierarchy. Next, press the Delete key on your keyboard. We're left with a single robot. This robot should be converted into a prefab. Prefabs can be created by dragging the game object from the hierarchy to the project window. Let's create the prefab inside the examples folder. After dragging the object, a couple of things will be different. Firstly, the icon has changed. Normally, the icon for a game object is an outline of a box. This time, the box is a solid color. Prefabs have different icons than regular game objects to help developers identify them. Next, let's select the prefab from the hierarchy. In the Inspector window, new options become available. The editor informs us that we're working with a prefab. Next to the text, there are buttons for opening the prefab. Let's avoid those buttons for now. By creating a prefab, the original copy will be tracked by Unity. We can drag the prefab into the scene or hierarchy to create a new copy of the prefab. For example, let's drag the robot prefab into the scene. As we do so, Unity displays a preview of the object. Very clearly, it looks the same as the first robot. In my opinion, it's difficult to position the prefab by dragging it into the scene. Dragging the prefab into the hierarchy is easier. The new robot may overlap with the first robot. Let's move it over with the Move tool. Great! We've got two copies of a prefab. The question becomes, how do we modify the appearance? Prefabs have a dedicated editing mode. We can enter this mode by double-clicking on the prefab from the project window. The scene window completely changes. Unlike before, we can't view other objects from the original scene. Unity switches from regular editing mode to prefab editing mode. This feature allows us to focus on a prefab in isolation. Like before, let's try increasing the scale of the robot with the Scale tool. Next, we can exit prefab editing mode by clicking on the arrow button at the top left corner of the hierarchy window. Would you look at that? Both game objects have been rescaled. They're referencing the original object. As long as we modify the prefab directly, the copies will copy the same modifications. This update does not just apply to existing objects. New objects will have the same modifications. For example, let's drag another robot prefab into the hierarchy. move the object with the Move tool. As you can see, they all look the same. There's another method to enter prefab editing mode. In the hierarchy, there's an arrow next to each prefab. If we click this button, we'll be taken to prefab editing mode. This time, things are slightly different. The game object is not isolated from the rest of the scene. Unlike before, the other objects become faded, thus giving us an idea of how our changes will be reflected in our game. Other than that, there isn't a difference between this mode and the other mode. Let's rotate the object. Next, exit prefab edit mode. Once again, the changes have been applied to all objects. In some cases, we may want to modify a specific prefab without affecting other copies. We can freely modify a copy without entering prefab mode. For example, let's select the first robot. Next, adjust the game object with the Scale tool to decrease its size. You'll notice I'm not entering prefab edit mode. This step is optional. As I adjust the scale, the other copies remain unaffected. As long as we're not entering prefab edit mode, the updates are applied to one copy. But let's say that I want this update to apply to all copies. Unity gives us the option of applying the changes to the original copy. In the inspector, there's a drop-down at the top of the window. It's called Overrides. If we were to select this drop-down, we'd be given a list of differences between this copy and the original copy. There are two options at our disposal. We can click on Revert to reverse the changes. This action will revert the current copy to the original copy. The other option is called Apply. By clicking this option, the original copy will have the same modifications as the current copy, thus causing the other copies to also update. Let's click on this option. After doing so, the other robots become smaller. Cool, right? Prefabs are very flexible. Best of all, the changes will be reflected in all scenes. If we had another scene with these robots, the changes would be visible from those copies too. Prefabs are very popular among the Unity community. We'll be using them throughout the course. In the next lecture, let's cover some final topics before moving on to our game.